It's a transformation from how things were 2 or 3 years ago. And that's partly the effect of Putin's war in Ukraine, partly Trump's complete unpredictability about our own security. And it's pushed the UK and the EU together, and now we've got the first fruits of that.
The Prime Minister seeks to reset relations with Europe. There's a deal to boost intelligence sharing. It all comes as 3 Iranians have been charged with suspected espionage and with targeting UK-based journalists. Peter Ricketts, Lord Ricketts, joins us. He's a former National Security Advisor and former head of the Foreign Office. Hello to you, Peter.
Hello, John.
Hi, can I just ask overall for your thoughts on this EU-UK reset today? What do you think?
Well, I think it's a good deal overall for both sides. A transformation from how things were 2 or 3 years ago. And that's partly the effect of Putin's war in Ukraine, partly Trump's complete unpredictability about our own security. And it's pushed the UK and the EU together, and now we've got the first fruits of that. A lot of it is to do with agreeing today that more detailed negotiations will go on in all sorts of areas, like the checks on food and plant products crossing the border, like emissions trading, like electricity trading, like youth mobility. So it's not done deals, but that's the way the EU operates. This is the decision in principle at the top level. It unlocks then detailed negotiations. But I think perhaps most of all, the Security and Defence Pact, including, as you say, intelligence sharing, defence industrial cooperation, putting the UK into all kinds of working groups and joint operations together with the EU, that's good. And that can move forward pretty fast, I think, without too much legal text to be agreed.
Well, let's talk a bit more then about that new shaking of hands on defence and security cooperation. How much difference is all that going to make? Because we're now facing, this common threat from Russia, Europe feeling the need for clear reasons to sort of band together more closely.
Yeah, and that's a lot of what's driven the two together, I think. I think one important area which will see big benefits for the UK is rather lost in the small print, but it says that they are going to negotiate access for us to this new 150 billion euro defence investment fund. At the moment, British defence businesses, which are the largest in Europe, can't take part in that. This will open the door to that. That will be important because all of us need to gear up our armaments industries. We need to help Ukraine. We need to restock our own armed forces. So that's important. Then there's a lot of detail about all the different working groups that we shall now be part of, have access to in the EU. And that's important because it gets the EU and the UK working together, the UK back in the game, helping to shape decisions, and much more as we were when we were a member state, helping out in dealing with the transformation that the EU has to go through in thinking of itself as a major defence power as well as an economic power.
Yeah, I mean closer cooperation in this context is its own cause. There's a very real threat to the East, and of course Europe needs to work more closely together. That seems a certain amount of common sense, but also there's a transactional element to this too, isn't there, Peter? Because there will be those voices in Europe that say, I think they are saying clearly, that Britain needs to put money into the defence budget pot as well as getting it out and handing it to British defence contractors and companies.
Yeah, but I think that's what you'd expect. I mean, this is EU money that they're borrowing on the markets, 150 billion euros worth. We can't just expect that that's going to be handed to UK defence companies. The UK will have to contribute, but equally will participate. EU member states will be buying products that are made through this cooperation, as will the UK. So I think it's a win-win on all sides. But essentially, it enables the very large and powerful and effective UK defence industry to get into the cooperations which will produce the capabilities we need. For example, when Trump starts pulling out US assets from Europe, we're going to have to get better as Europeans at building new, some of it very expensive defence kit, some of it is ammunition and so on. All of that, the UK defence industry can help. And it makes sense that we contribute and we participate and everyone comes out a winner.
Okay, more broadly, Peter, do you think the Prime Minister, Keir Starmer, could have edged closer to Europe in this set of talks, maybe involving more freedom of movement for young people, say? Should he have done that, in your view?
Well, I mean, I'm a bit disappointed at the lack of detail about what this famous youth mobility scheme will be. At the moment, we've got no numbers, we've got no detail how long people can stay, whether they've resolved the awkward problem that the EU wants access for EU students to British universities at British domestic rates. So there's clearly a lot more crunching of detail to do in that. Yes, the government could have gone further. That's a political calculation they've made. But at least we are seeing now references to doing a youth mobility deal, getting back into the Erasmus program, allowing British passengers to use European e-gates at airports. All of these are benefits. One thing which is a disappointment is that there's nothing on the touring artists, the problems that creatives have in traveling around the EU. That was a big request from right across the creative sector here. And I think a lot of the EU as well. That hasn't been done. So there's more work required on that. But inevitably not going to get everything.
Yeah, well, indeed, it is a trade-off. It is a negotiation. And some of those criticising this deal say that this is going to inhibit future progress with other traders, including maybe the USA in future. Do you think that stands up?
No, I don't. I mean, first of all, they've been able to do a trade agreement with the US without cutting across this. And the sorts of things that would really complicate making a deal with the EU work would be if the UK signed up to something like allowing genome-modified beef or chlorine-washed chicken into the UK market, but then that could obviously not go into the EU market. I don't think the government are going to do that. So they've shown with an India deal and a deal with the Americans that they can do trade deals with third countries and still come up with something which really eases the restrictions and the red tape on doing trade with Europe. Right. So they've walked the tightrope so far, and I guess that they will go on doing so.
Right. Well, in the time we've got, just a couple of minutes more, I do want to ask you to think about the what's going on in Gaza with the Israel government, because Benjamin Netanyahu, the Prime Minister of Israel, he's now saying, well, he published a plan to occupy pretty much all of Israel, and he says there'll be some increase in humanitarian aid and food allowed into Gaza. What do you think?
Well, I think it's frankly awful what's been happening with the blockade on food. You can see the terrible suffering and now the renewed violence as this major military campaign going on. And I'm afraid the Israelis have no plan for what happens if and when the fighting stops, except perhaps occupying Gaza, perhaps trying to expel as much of the population as possible. And that, with the Americans not being very active, he feels impunity to think about that. What the UK should be doing, I think, really, is working with the moderate Arab states and other Europeans to have a better plan for what happens when the fighting finally finishes in Gaza. Yeah. And that has to be a settlement with the moderate Arabs moving in, helping with reconstruction, better plans for security, eliminating Hamas from security in Gaza, of course, but giving the Palestinians some sort of prospect for the future. So I think although Britain has very little influence over Netanyahu, there are things Britain can be doing both on the humanitarian side and to prepare for the post-conflict, which I don't think either the Americans or the Israelis are really thinking about.
Yeah, and the British defence sales to Israel are a very small proportion of Israel's defence procurement. But is there any argument in favour of that now, given the way this conflict has progressed?
Well, in my view, no. I think there should now be a suspension of all arms sales. The difficult thing is that the UK provides spare parts into the F-35 fighter program, which American program, into a global pool which can go to F-35s anywhere, including Israel. So there's an issue about that. But for the rest, I think we should simply suspend all military aid to Israel, given the horrors that are happening day by day there. I can't see any argument now for continuing to supply arms, and that's a step that they could take straight away. They could also pull out of trade negotiations that have been sort of, supposedly going on, but not much happening in them for some time. I think those sort of gestures, putting sanctions on some of the hard right Israeli politicians like Mr. Smotrich and Mr. Ben-Gvir, who've been saying hateful things, all of those wouldn't change Israeli minds, but would show what the UK stands for, would make a point, and would, I'm sure, be very welcomed by many people in Israel and in the US.
You clearly took a very strong line against the way that Israel's conducting this conflict. Do you believe Israel's guilty of war crimes?
Well, I'll leave that to the courts, but I can't think how what they've been doing in terms of attacking civilian infrastructure, denying humanitarian support when they are the occupying power, I don't see how that cannot be a war crime. But I will leave the lawyers to decide that one way or the other.
All right. Very frankly spoken, Peter Ricketts, thank you so much, and the former head of the Foreign Office.